You embarrass me!" With these cruel words, an autistic boy of only 12 years old was left alone by his own parents at a bus station. With a torn backpack and a lost look, he still whispered, "I promise I'll get better." Days later, his name printed in large letters on a newspaper makes the family run desperately to find him. But the reason why it made the news is something that no one could have imagined. During the wake of an orphan boy who was rejected by his parents, the family discovers that he has become a world-famous genius. No, this cannot be happening. Our own son. What stupidity we did. It was a Monday afternoon when Margaret held her trembling hands on the steering wheel, taking a deep breath and trying to muster up the courage for what she was about to do. Next to her in the passenger seat, Robert checked his phone for the third time in 2 minutes, avoiding looking at the back seat where Thomas was sitting, quietly, with his old backpack on his lap and his eyes fixed on the window. "Thomas, look at me," Margaret said, turning back with a forced expression. "We're doing this because you need special care that we can't give." The 12-year-old boy stared at her with those confused eyes, full of a heart-wrenching innocence. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he felt a heavy tension in the air, an atmosphere of farewell that made him uneasy. "Mommy, was I really hard today?" she asked in a low voice, nervously fiddling with the strap of her backpack. "I promise I'll try to be more normal, okay?" Margaret closed her eyes for a second, feeling the lump in her throat tighten. When he opened it, his expression was hardened. "It's not about being normal, Thomas. It's about you needing a place where other people like you live." Robert cleared his throat, still not taking his eyes off his phone. "Margaret, let's get on with it. I have a meeting at 3. She started the car again and followed the street that led to the municipal shelter. Thomas kept looking out the window, watching the houses go by, not knowing that he would never see his own house again. His small hands held tight to the backpack that contained his only possessions. Some clothes, 2 math books and a notebook where he drew complex patterns that only he understood. "Mommy," she called again, her voice even lower. "Are you going to pick me up tomorrow?" The silence that settled in the car was deafening. Margaret tightened the steering wheel even tighter, her knuckles turning white. Robert snorted softly and mumbled something about always the same questions. It was when they arrived in front of the shelter building that reality hit Thomas for good. Margaret pulled up abruptly, turned off the engine and got out of the car with quick, nervous movements. He opened the rear door and pulled the boy out without delicacy. "Margaret, calm down," Robert said, finally taking his eyes off his phone as he saw his wife lose her composure. Calm down, she shouted, turning to her husband with her eyes full of furious tears. "Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I want to do that?" Thomas began to understand that something was very wrong. The building in front of him was grey, with bars on the windows and a sign that said Santa Rita Municipal Shelter. There were other children playing in the courtyard, but they all looked different from him in some way that he couldn't explain. "Mommy, I don't want to stay here," he said, trying to hold on to her skirt. "Please, I'll be better, I promise." It was at this moment that Margaret completely lost control. He turned to Thomas with an expression of anger and frustration accumulated from years. "You embarrass me! Every time we go out, every time you have one of your crises, everyone looks at us like we're abnormal." The words came out like stones. Thomas drew back, his eyes filling with tears as he tried to process why his mother was yelling at him like that. "You don't understand what it's like to have a child like you," continued Margaret, out of control. "The other mothers run away from me, Thomas. Nobody wants their kids to play with you because you're weird, you're too different." "Margaret, stop!" Robert tried to intervene, but it was too late. "I can't take it anymore. I can't stand pretending that everything is fine anymore. I can't stand the therapies, the doctors, the looks of pity." She pushed Thomas toward the gate of the shelter. "Here you will be with people who know how to deal with people like you." Thomas was shaking now, tears streaming down his face as he desperately clutched his backpack. "Mommy, I love you. Please don't leave me here." For a moment, Margaret hesitated. She saw her small, vulnerable son begging not to be abandoned, and something inside her broke. But then he looked at Robert, who had already returned to the car and was tapping his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel, worried about his political meeting, his image, his career that could not be tarnished by a troubled son. "It'll be better this way," he said finally, his voice cracking. For everyone. She rang the doorbell of the shelter, and when the door opened, she pushed Thomas inside without looking back. The boy turned around one last time, watching his parents get into the car and drive away. Robert didn't even look out the window. Margaret looked in the rearview mirror for a second, saw her son standing in the doorway with his backpack in his hands, and sped up so as not to change her mind. Thomas stood there, watching the car disappear around the corner, until a soft voice caught his attention. "Hi, dear. What's your name?" He turned around to see a woman in her 40s, with brown hair tied up in a scruffy bun and gentle eyes behind simple glasses. It was Sarah, the shelter director. "Thomas," he replied quietly, still holding tight to his backpack. "Thomas is a beautiful name," Sarah said, bending down to be at his height. "Do you want to come in? It's a little cold out here." He nodded, following her inside. The inside of the shelter was simple but clean. There were drawings of the children pasted on the walls, and the smell of soup came from the kitchen. "Where are my parents?" asked Thomas, still waiting for them to return. Sarah sighed softly, having been through this situation before. "They had to leave, Thomas. But you'll be fine here, I promise." That night, lying on a small bed in a dormitory with 5 other children, Thomas cried softly until he fell asleep, clutching his backpack as if it were his only friend in the world. He didn't yet know that this would be the first day of the journey that would transform him from a rejected boy into a genius who would change the world. On the other side of town, Margaret and Robert dined in silence. The house seemed strangely empty without the sounds Thomas made, without his constant questions, without his peculiar but familiar presence. It was the right thing to do, Robert said. More to himself than to herself, Margaret did not answer. She just stared at the empty chair where Thomas used to sit and wondered if she would ever be able to forgive herself for what she had just done. In the first days in the shelter, Thomas barely left the room. He would sit on the edge of the bed, organizing and rearranging the few things in his backpack, waiting for someone to come and pick him up. Sarah tried to talk to him over meals, but he only answered with monosyllables, his eyes always fixed on the door, as if he expected to see Margaret and Robert appear at any moment. "Thomas, would you like to meet the other children?" asked Sarah one morning, sitting next to him in the cafeteria. He shook his head negatively, distractedly fiddling with the numbers he had written on a sheet of paper. They were complex sequences, patterns that formed perfect geometric designs. "What are you doing there?" asked Sarah, genuinely curious. Just some numbers," Thomas replied quietly. "They make sense when they get together in the right way." Sarah picked up the sheet gently. He didn't understand much about math, but he could see that these were not just child's doodles. There was something systematic, something almost scientific in those standards. "Where did you learn to do that?" Thomas shrugged. "I always knew. The numbers speak to me, you know. They tell stories." It was at that moment that Sarah realized that she had something very special on her hands. That same afternoon, he called the municipal school and got Thomas a spot, even in the middle of the semester. At school, things were not easy at first. Thomas was too different from the other 12-year-old boys. While they played on the playground, he would sit under a tree drawing patterns in the earth with a stick, or watching as the leaves fell following precise mathematical trajectories. "Hey, weirdo," shouted Bruno, a bigger boy, snatching the notebook from Thomas's hands during recess. "What crazy drawings are these?" "Give it back to me, please," Thomas asked, extending his hand. Bruno opened his notebook and started laughing. "Look at that, guys. The orphan draws numbers." Other boys approached, laughing and pointing. Thomas felt his face burn with shame, the same words of his mother echoing in his head. "You embarrass me. You're weird. You're too different." That was when teacher Maria Jose approached. "What's going on here?" "Nothing, Auntie," Bruno said, returning the notebook to Thomas. "I was only seeing his drawings." But Maria Jose was not fooled. He took the notebook from Thomas's trembling hands and took a look. What she saw left her speechless. It wasn't just drawings. They were complex equations, geometric theorems, mathematical sequences that she could barely understand. "Thomas, can you stay a little bit after class today?" she asked gently. That afternoon, sitting alone in the classroom, Maria Jose showed the notebook to Thomas. "Can you explain to me what this means here?" Thomas hesitated for a moment. No one had ever been genuinely interested in his drawings before. They were always a source of shame or strangeness, Well, he began shyly, I was thinking about how numbers relate to each other. Like if you take the Fibonacci sequence and apply it to a geometric progression, you can predict patterns that appear in nature. Maria Jose blinked several times. Those words coming out of the mouth of a 12-year-old boy seemed impossible. And where did you learn about Fibonacci sequence? I read it in a book that I found thrown away near the shelter, Thomas replied. But I already knew that the numbers worked like this. I just didn't know it had a name. That night, Maria Jose called Sarah, her voice full of excitement. Sarah, you need to arrange auditions for this boy. He's not just smart, he's a prodigy, Sarah frowned. What do you mean? He's solving advanced math problems without ever having formally studied. I showed him a high school calculation problem just to test, and he solved it in less than 5 minutes. At the shelter, while the other children watched TV, Thomas stayed in the small makeshift library that Sarah had set up in a corner of the living room. But children's books did not interest him. He looked for technical manuals, old encyclopedias, anything with numbers or patterns. It was when Sarah brought an old computer, donated by a local company, that something amazing happened. Thomas looked at the machine with shining eyes. Can I touch it? He asked shyly. Sure, but do you know how to use a computer? Thomas nodded, and within minutes he was navigating the basic functions as if he had been born knowing. In a matter of hours, he had figured out how to access the shelter's dial-up internet and was devouring content about programming, algorithms and advanced math. Sarah, come and see this, one of the caregivers called one afternoon. Thomas did an amazing thing. They approached the computer and saw on the screen a simple program that Thomas had created. It was a game of patterns that generated progressively more complex mathematical sequences. How did you learn to do that? Asked Sarah, impressed. I understood how the computer thinks, Thomas replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He speaks a language of numbers just like me. That night, Sarah stayed up late researching gifted children. He found articles about precocious geniuses, about how family abandonment was often linked to the difficulty of ordinary parents, dealing with extraordinary children. She understood that Margaret and Robert did not abandon Thomas because he was troubled or difficult. They abandoned him because his genius scared them, made them feel inadequate, forced them to face their own limitations. But here at the shelter, away from parents who couldn't see his potential, Thomas was flourishing. For the first time in his life, he had someone who valued his difference instead of trying to suppress it. On the other side of town, Margaret was distractedly fiddling with the food for dinner. It had been a week since Thomas had been left at the shelter, and she couldn't stop thinking about him. Do you think he's okay? He asked Robert. Of course it is, he replied, without taking his eyes off the newspaper. That place specializes in children like him. But Margaret knew something was wrong, not with Thomas, but with them. They had abandoned their own son because they did not know how to deal with his genius. And now, in a quiet, empty house, they were beginning to feel the real weight of what they had lost. 3 months had passed since Thomas had arrived at the shelter. The boy who had barely spoken before now spent hours explaining complex theories to Sarah, who listened fascinated, even though she didn't understand half of what he said. The old computer had become his main tool, and he was creating increasingly sophisticated programs. Sarah, can you come here for a minute? Called Thomas one Thursday afternoon, his voice charged with an excitement she hadn't heard in weeks. She approached the computer and found Thomas with his eyes shining, pointing to the screen full of code and graphics. What did you do this time? He asked, smiling. I was thinking about my grandmother, Thomas said, his voice getting lower. Before my parents brought me here, she lived with us. She had a disease that made her forget things, Sarah nodded. Alzheimer's. And I was very sad seeing her try to remember my name, you know? Sometimes she looked at me as if I was a stranger. Thomas paused, fidgeting nervously with his hands. Then I started thinking, what if there was a way to discover this disease before it gets so bad? He turned to his computer and began to explain quickly. I found that when people start to get Alzheimer's, they change the way they speak, before they even forget the important things. It's very subtle, but it has patterns. Sarah frowned. What do you mean, standards? They stop using certain words. They start repeating others. The sentence structure changes. Thomas clicked on some files on the screen. So I created a program that analyzes how a person speaks and can detect these micro-patterns that indicate the beginning of the disease. What Sarah saw on the screen took her breath away. Complex graphs, statistical analyses, algorithms that she could not even pronounce, much less understand. Thomas, does it really work? I tested it with recordings I found on the internet of people who developed Alzheimer's. The program was able to identify the signs too, up to 3 years before the official medical diagnosis. He looked at her with a mixture of pride and sadness. If I had this before, maybe my grandmother could have been treated sooner. That same night, Sarah called Maria Jose. "Professor, do you know anyone from the university? I need an expert to see what Thomas has created." 2 weeks later, Dr. Ricardo Mendoza, a professor of computer science at the Federal University, was sitting in the shelter staring in disbelief at Thomas's work. "How old is this boy?" he asked Sarah. 12, you'll be 13 next month." Dr. Mendoza shook his head in impressment. "Sarah, do you understand the magnitude of what he created? There are labs all over the world spending millions of dollars trying to develop just that." He turned to Thomas, who was quiet in the corner, awkwardly with so much attention. "Son, can you show me how the program works?" For an hour, Thomas explained every detail of his creation, how he had collected data, how he had developed the algorithm, how he had tested and refined the system. Dr. Mendoza took frantic notes, shaking his head from time to time. "It's genius," he murmured. "Simply genius. So does it really work?" asked Thomas shyly. "Does it work? Boy, this could revolutionize the early diagnosis of neurodegenerative diseases. You can save millions of lives." That's when Dr. Mendoza picked up the phone and called a contact at the university. "Professor Martinez? You need to come here now. I found a genius." In the following days, Thomas's life changed completely. University professors visited the shelter. Journalists called for interviews. Technology companies offered partnerships. Sarah protected Thomas like a mother lioness, filtering visits and making sure he had time to be a child. Despite all the commotion, "Are you scared of all this?" she asked one night, sitting next to him in the dormitory. "A little bit," Thomas admitted. "I just wanted to help people like my grandmother. I didn't expect it to turn all this around. You know you're going to have to make some important decisions, right? Universities want to give you scholarships. Companies want to buy your discovery." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, will you continue to be my family? Even if I get out of here?" She felt her eyes water. "Of course, my angel. Always." It was in the midst of all this turmoil that the news leaked to the local press. The investigative reporter for the city newspaper had uncovered the story and decided it deserved the front page. The next morning, the headline screamed in bold letters, "Young Municipal Shelter. Genius develops revolutionary cure. Thomas Mitchell. 15 can save millions of lives." The article told the whole story. The abandonment by her parents, the life in the shelter, the extraordinary discovery. There were photos of Thomas in the makeshift lab, testimonials from university professors, and the detailed description of how his algorithm worked. The news spread like wildfire. National TV stations called wanting interviews. International technology sites echoed the story. The name Thomas Mitchell was everywhere, and in a house on the other side of town, Margaret nearly fainted when she saw the newspaper on the breakfast table. "Robert! Robert!" she shouted, her voice coming out strangled. He ran downstairs thinking something terrible had happened. "What's wrong, Margaret?" She just pointed to the newspaper, her hands shaking. Robert picked up the paper and read the headline. His face turned pale, his eyes widening as he read every word. "No, it can't be our Thomas," he murmured. But it was. The photo left no doubt. Here was his son, 3 years older, smiling sheepishly next to the computer where he had created something that could change the world. Margaret began to cry, tears falling on the paper. "What did we do, Robert? What did we do?" Robert, always so controlled, so focused on his public image, felt the ground collapse beneath his feet. He had abandoned a genius. She had rejected a son who could have been her proudest child. And now, the whole world knew that Thomas Mitchell, the child prodigy who was changing medicine, had been abandoned by his parents in a municipal shelter. Robert's political campaign, which seemed so promising, was about to turn into the biggest scandal of his life. The doorbell of the shelter kept ringing. Sarah looked through the viewfinder and sighed heavily as she recognized the couple at the door. Margaret was visibly nervous, straightening her hair every 2 seconds, while Robert checked his phone and looked around as if he feared being photographed. "They came," Sarah said to Thomas, who was in the makeshift lab they had set up for him. "Your parents." Thomas stopped typing, his hands freezing on the keyboard. Do they want to see me? They want to take you back," Sarah replied, her voice charged with restrained anger. The boy, now 15 and much more mature than he should be for his age, sighed. "Let them in." Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure? You don't have to talk to them if you don't want to." "I know, but I need to hear what they have to say." 5 minutes later, Margaret and Robert were in the living room of the shelter, sitting on the worn sofa while Thomas stood across the room, Sarah protectively beside him. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Thomas, my son, how are you?" Thomas stared at her with an expression that mixed hurt and curiosity. "I'm fine." "Better than ever, actually." Robert cleared his throat, trying to regain his political composure. "Son, we made a terrible mistake. We were going through a difficult time and—" "Difficult time?" interrupted Thomas, his voice firmer than anyone expected. "You called me shameful. They said I was too weird to live with you." Margaret began to cry. "We didn't know, Thomas. We didn't know you were so special." "Special." Thomas gave a bitter laugh that sounded strange coming out of a teenager's mouth. "I've always been special, Mom. You just didn't want to see it." Sarah stepped forward. "With all due respect, but you are 3 years late. Where were you when Thomas spent his nights crying, waiting for you to come back?" Robert stood up, trying to assume an authoritarian posture. "Look here, we are his parents. We have rights." "Rights?" Thomas's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What rights? You gave up any rights the day you pushed me into that gate." Margaret approached, trying to touch her son's face. "Thomas, please, you need to understand. We were young, inexperienced." Thomas retreated, avoiding touch. You were 35 years old when you abandoned me. They weren't children. That's when Robert lost his temper and showed his true nature. "Listen here, kid. You may be a genius now, but you're still underage. Legally, you belong to us." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas looked at the man he had once called father, seeing him for the first time with complete clarity. "Do I belong to you?" he repeated slowly. "As an object? Like a property?" Sarah was already taking her cell phone out of her pocket. "I'm going to call the social worker. This conversation is over." "No, Sarah," said Thomas, his voice calm but decisive. "Let me talk." He turned to Robert, his eyes shining with an intimidating wit. "Do you want to know the truth? You didn't abandon me because I was problematic. You abandoned me because I made you feel small." Margaret stopped crying, shocked by the precision of the words. "Every time I solved a problem you didn't understand, every time I asked you a question you didn't know the answer to, you felt inadequate. And instead of being proud of having a special child, you chose to get rid of me." Robert tried to interrupt, but Thomas continued. "And now that the whole world knows who I am, you want it back. Not out of love, not because they miss me, but because they want to be associated with my success." Thomas walked to the window, looking out into the courtyard where other children were playing. "Do you know what the irony is? You called me abnormal, weird. But here at the shelter, surrounded by rejected children like me, I finally discovered what it is to be normal. It's normal to have someone who believes in you, who supports you, who loves you for who you are." He turned to his parents again. "Sarah never made me feel ashamed for being different. She celebrated every little achievement, gave me books when I wanted to learn, stayed up with me when I had nightmares thinking about you." Margaret was sobbing now. "Thomas, we've learned. We have changed. Have you changed?" Thomas laughed sadly. "You have not changed. You only saw an opportunity. The problematic kid became a famous genius, and now they want to go on stage with me." It was at that moment that the social worker arrived, accompanied by a team of TV cameras that had found out about the meeting. Robert turned pale when he saw the journalists. "Mr. Mitchell," shouted one reporter, "is it true that you abandoned your son at the shelter 3 years ago?" The politician tried to smile for the cameras, but the smile came out forced and fake. There was a misunderstanding. "Special circumstances? What circumstances justify abandoning a 12-year-old child?" the reporter insisted. Thomas watched everything with a calm that was disturbing for his age. He saw his father squirming at the questions. He saw his mother trying to hide from the cameras. and he felt a mixture of pity and relief. "Thomas," shouted another journalist, "do you intend to move back in with your parents?" The boy approached the microphones, Sarah at his side offering silent support. "My parents died to me 3 years ago," Thomas said, his voice clear and firm. "So the people who are here today are just strangers who share my genetic material." Margaret let out a groan of pain. "Sarah is my family now. She adopted me when no one else wanted me. She's my real mother." The cameras captured every word, every expression. On the other hand, Margaret and Robert realized that they were not just parents rejected by a child. They were villains in a story that the whole world was watching. Robert tried one last card. "Thomas, think about your future. We can offer you a better life, resources that a shelter will never have." "Resources?" Thomas interrupted him. "Do you think it's about money? About material comfort?" He gestured to the simple shelter around. "Here I discovered who I am. Here I have created something that can save millions of lives. Here I learned what unconditional love is." Thomas looked directly at the cameras. "I don't need parents who only love me when it's convenient for them. I already have a family that loves me for who I am." And with those words, Robert Mitchell's political career was shattered forever. The man who had abandoned his own son for convenience would now face the public consequences of his cruelty. The following days were a media hurricane that swept through the city like a relentless storm. The scandal of the candidate who abandoned his genius son was on all channels, in all newspapers, on all social networks. Margaret and Robert found themselves at the center of a public lynching that gave no respite. "Disgrace, Robert. Total disgrace," shouted his political aide, throwing a stack of newspapers on the office desk. "His approval plummeted to 3%. 3%. Not even your own mother would vote for you now." Robert was sunk in the leather armchair, his face gray, his hands shaking as he read the devastating headlines. "The denatured father. Cruel politician abandons genius. The shame of a family. Is there a way to reverse it?" he asked in a hoarse voice. The aide laughed bitterly. "Reverse? Robert, you abandoned a 12-year-old autistic child, a child who became a world prodigy. There is no PR machine on the planet that can clean up this mess." On the other side of town, Margaret was locked in her room crying for 3 days straight. The neighbors of the luxury condominium where they lived avoided her in the elevator. The old friends no longer answered her calls. Even the cleaning lady had resigned, saying that she could not work for people who abandoned children. The phone rang for the 100th time that day. It was another journalist wanting a statement, another TV program asking for an interview. Margaret hung up without answering, as she had done for days. Meanwhile, at the shelter, Thomas lived his most intense and rewarding days. His discovery had drawn international attention, and proposals poured in from universities around the world. MIT, Harvard, Stanford, listed Sarah, flipping through the envelopes. "Thomas, you have universities on 3 continents offering full scholarships." Thomas was at the computer, further refining his algorithm, now with the help of renowned researchers who made daily video calls to collaborate with him. And Dr. Chen said his pharmaceutical company wants to invest $50 million in developing its program. Sarah continued. "50 million? Thomas stopped typing, impressed. "Sarah, do you realize that with this money, we can renovate the entire shelter? Can you create scholarships for all the children here?" Sarah smiled, her eyes watering with pride. "You always think of others first, right?" It was that same afternoon that the lawyer Dr. Enrique Sampaio arrived at the shelter with a folder full of documents. "Sarah, Thomas, brought important news," he said, adjusting his glasses. The public prosecutor's office decided to file a case against Margaret and Robert Mitchell for abandonment of incapacitated. Thomas frowned. "Process? Yes, abandoning a child with special needs is a crime, Thomas. They could face 2 to 6 years in prison." Sarah sighed. "Doctor, Thomas doesn't want them to be arrested. He has already made that clear." "I know, but it no longer depends on his will. The crime was public. There is documentary evidence, testimonies." Dr. Enrique opened the briefcase. "In addition, you can file a lawsuit for moral damages. The amount can easily reach a few million." Thomas shook his head. "I don't want their money." "Thomas," Sarah said gently, "is not about revenge. It's about justice, and about making sure that never happens to another child." That night, Robert received the court summons at home. He read the document with trembling hands, Margaret weeping beside him. "Abandonment of the incapable," he murmured. "Moral damages in the amount of 5 million rees." "We don't have 5 million, Margaret sobbed. "We spent everything on the campaign, on the new house." Robert crumpled the paper angrily. "That ungrateful kid. After all we did for him. All that we have done?" Margaret stared at him with her eyes red from crying. "Robert, we abandoned our own son in a public institution. What exactly did we do for him?" It was the first time in years that Margaret confronted her husband. And for the first time, she saw clearly the selfish and cruel person she had married. Meanwhile, at the shelter, Thomas was giving an interview for an international documentary about gifted children. "How do you feel about your biological parents?" the journalist asked. Thomas thought for a moment before answering. "I feel sorry for them. They missed the chance to follow something incredible. They missed the chance to see their son find out who he really is. Do you forgive them?" Forgiving does not mean forgetting or accepting back. It means releasing anger so that it doesn't stop me from growing. Thomas looked directly at the camera. "I forgive, but they made their choice. Now I've made mine." The interview aired in prime time and was seen by millions of people. Among them Margaret, who watched crying on the empty sofa of her silent mansion. 2 months later, the trial was a public spectacle. The courtroom was packed with journalists and onlookers. Robert and Margaret sat in the dock, heads bowed as their careers, reputations, and lives publicly crumbled. Thomas was called as a witness, but refused to testify against them. "I will not collaborate either to harm or to help," he told the judge. "They made their choices. Now take the consequences." The judge himself became emotional during the sentence. Rarely have I seen such a clear case of abandonment motivated by pure selfishness. A special child was treated as a nuisance, as an embarrassment to the family. Robert was sentenced to 4 years in prison, Margaret to 3.5 years. In addition, they were forced to pay compensation of 3 million reais to Thomas, an amount that would be fully allocated to improvements in the shelter. On the day of the sentencing, Sarah asked Thomas, "How do you feel?" "Relieved," he replied, "not because they were punished, but because it is now officially closed. They are no longer part of my history." 6 months later, Thomas embarked for MIT on a full scholarship. At 16, he would be the youngest student in the history of the university. Hertz's algorithm was already being tested in hospitals around the world, saving thousands of lives. At the farewell, Sarah hugged him tightly. "I will miss you, my son." "I'll be back," Thomas promised. "On vacation, on holidays, whenever you can. You're my real family." On the other side of town, in a much smaller house they had been forced to buy after losing everything, Margaret looked out the window. There was a picture of Thomas as a child on the table, the only one they managed to save before destroying all the others. "Will he forgive us one day?" he asked Robert. Robert, who had aged 10 years in a few months, sighed. "Margaret, we lost the right to ask for forgiveness. We lost the right to be his family. I just wanted a chance," she murmured. "We had the chance. For 12 years, and we chose to throw it away." 5 years later, Dr. Thomas Mitchell, now 21, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his revolutionary discovery. Millions of people around the world had been diagnosed early and treated thanks to his work. During his acceptance speech, he thanked Sarah Mitchell, my mom, who taught me that family is not the one who gives you life, but who chooses to be by your side when life gets tough. Margaret watched it on TV, weeping silently. Thomas had chosen Sarah's last name. He was no longer a biological Mitchell. It was a Mitchell by choice, by love, by gratitude. And so, the boy who was abandoned for being too different became living proof that sometimes it is the normal who need to learn about humanity. Comment "Genius of the Heart" so I know you've made it to the end of this story, and mark your comment with a beautiful heart. And just like the story of Thomas and Sarah, I have another exciting narrative to share with you. Just click on the video that is now appearing on your screen and embark on another exciting story. A big kiss and I'll wait for you there.